Mussolini's fascist regime unleashed horrors on women, rape, forced labor, and brutality, destroying their lives in the name of empire. But by 1945, the walls of his empire were crumbling. Then on April 28, 1945, Mussolini was captured and executed by partisans, finally ending his reign of terror. Mussolini saw women not as independent individuals with their own desires and rights, but as essential instruments to build a stronger Italian empire. His vision was rooted in rigid traditional roles that reinforced the patriarchal values of his government. The regime's motto for women was blunt and clear: children, kitchen, church. This wasn't just an ideal, it was a command. In the late 1920s and throughout the 30s, Mussolini implemented sweeping policies to ensure that Italy's population would grow rapidly, believing that a larger population would provide more soldiers, workers, and supporters for the future fascist empire. He was determined to produce a demographic explosion, and women were the key to that vision. To achieve this, his regime outlawed contraception and banned abortion, making it illegal for women to control their own reproductive rights. These measures were coupled with relentless propaganda that glorified motherhood, painting it as the ultimate patriotic duty of every Italian woman. The Battle for Births, launched in 1927, was one of the most visible campaigns in Mussolini's push to increase the population. Women were offered financial incentives and tax exemptions for each child they bore. Families with many children received substantial rewards, while those who had fewer, or none at all, were penalized with higher taxes. In fact, the regime even awarded medals to mothers who had more than 6 children, effectively turning motherhood into a state-sponsored activity. On the other hand, single women, or those who chose not to marry or have children, were stigmatized and ostracized. Their perceived failure to fulfill their duty to the state was met with harsh consequences. The regime's obsession with motherhood was deeply ingrained in education. Girls were taught from a very young age that their primary role in society was to be loyal wives and prolific mothers. Education for girls was designed to prepare them for a life of domesticity, rather than an intellectual pursuit or career. High academic achievements were discouraged, and academic institutions actively reinforced the idea that women were best suited for roles of wife, mother, and caregiver, rather than thinkers or professionals. Women who did not conform to these roles faced heavy penalties. Female employment, particularly in the public sector, was severely restricted. In 1933, Mussolini passed a law that limited the number of women in public administration jobs to just 10%. Even in the private sector, women were pushed out of their positions to make room for men. Many women were fired from their jobs, especially in government offices, teaching positions, or any occupation deemed unsuitable for women under the fascist ideal. Women were also heavily discouraged from pursuing higher education or careers outside the home. Those who defied these expectations and sought to build independent lives for themselves were often labeled as degenerates or deviants by the regime. Some faced harassment, surveillance, or even worse consequences. Those who resisted the pressure to marry or bear children were often publicly shamed. The goal of these policies wasn't just to suppress women's rights. It was to make women tools of the state. Women who openly criticized Mussolini were labeled as enemies of the state. Even minor acts like tearing down a propaganda poster or defacing an image of Il Duce would result in arrest. Some women were detained for writing anti-fascist letters, voicing dissent in public, or refusing to join fascist women's groups. One of the most targeted acts was aiding in or seeking out illegal abortions. These women were seen not only as lawbreakers, but as traitors to the state's mission to increase the population. Even helping a friend find contraception could result in being reported to the authorities. The regime also used psychiatric institutions as a tool for silencing women who were considered difficult. Many were labeled as mentally unstable or morally unfit simply for refusing traditional roles. Women who worked full-time jobs while raising children, those who remained unmarried, or who challenged male authority at home or work, were sometimes forcibly confined to asylums under vague diagnoses like female hysteria or sexual deviance. Inside these institutions, the treatment was often degrading and inhumane. Some women were subjected to medical experiments or kept in solitary confinement. As World War II raged on, Mussolini's fascist regime extended its brutal grasp into occupied territories such as Yugoslavia, Slovenia, and Croatia. In these regions, the Italian military established a network of internment and concentration camps, designed not just as temporary holding sites, but as key instruments in a calculated strategy to crush resistance and instill fear within the civilian population. One of the most infamous of these camps was the Rab concentration camp, located on the Croatian island of Rab. Originally intended to hold political prisoners and suspected rebels, Rab quickly became a site of mass internment, overcrowded with civilians and entire families ripped from their homes with little or no warning. In October 1942, the camp housed 10,619 internees, including 3,413 women and children. These women were not combatants or criminals. They were mothers, farmers' wives, elderly grandmothers, ordinary people who'd been caught in the fascist net, simply because of their association with suspected rebels or partisan sympathizers. The conditions of Rab were beyond dire, designed to break the spirits of captives. The barracks in which the internees were confined were hopelessly overcrowded, with no heating, no running water, and no basic sanitation facilities. This lack of cleanliness and space led to the spread of disease, creating a perfect breeding ground for typhus, dysentery, and other deadly illnesses. Food was severely rationed, often spoiled or insufficient to sustain anybody, and the women in the camp were left to watch their children waste away from malnutrition. Untreated fevers, or infections that could have been easily prevented with proper care. Many of the women, particularly those who were stronger or more able, were forced to perform grueling labor, such as digging trenches, carrying heavy materials, or working under brutal supervision. The Italian officers overseeing these tasks treated the women with open contempt, subjecting them to physical abuse and verbal degradation. But those who were too weak or ill to work were not spared. They were often left to deteriorate in the squalor of the overcrowded barracks. The mortality rate at the Rab camp soared, especially during the winter months when conditions became even more unbearable. The freezing cold, combined with the lack of proper clothing and blankets, led to widespread hypothermia, and many women died of starvation or exposure. The death toll was so high that the authorities rarely kept official records of who had died, and families were often unable to retrieve the bodies of their loved ones for a proper burial. Beyond the physical suffering, the psychological toll on women in the camps was profound. Mothers were forced to witness the slow death of their children, unable to do anything to help. Wives saw their husbands tortured, executed, or sent away to other camps. Their pain was not a mere statistic. It was a real and enduring suffering. One of the most violent and repressive episodes of Mussolini's fascist expansion was Italy's colonial campaign in Libya during the 1930s. After facing stiff resistance from local tribes, especially in the eastern region of Cyrenaica, Mussolini sent General Rodolfo Graziani to crush the opposition with overwhelming force. What followed was a systematic campaign of terror that included mass executions, forced relocations, and brutal acts against civilians, particularly women. Libyan women were often caught in the middle of this repression. Italian soldiers routinely conducted village raids where women were beaten, raped, or murdered in front of their families. And these acts were not random. They were used as weapons of war, methods to break the morale of local communities and erase any support for resistance fighters. In many cases, entire families were punished for the actions of one member suspected of being a rebel. One of the most horrifying elements of the campaign was the establishment of concentration camps, such as those in El Agheila and Suluk. where tens of thousands of civilians were forcibly relocated. Women and children made up a large percentage of the detainees. These camps had no proper shelter, food, or sanitation. Starvation and disease were rampant, and medical care was non-existent. Eyewitness reports and later investigations revealed that women often died slowly from malnutrition, while others succumbed to untreated infections or childbirth complications in the camps. The use of chemical weapons by Italian forces added another layer of cruelty. Graziani authorized the deployment of poison gas, including mustard gas, against both rebels and civilian populations. Entire villages were sprayed from the air with no regard for women, children, or the elderly. Those who didn't die immediately were left to suffer from painful burns, blindness, and respiratory problems. Italian propaganda at the time portrayed the Libyan resistance as barbaric, justifying the repression. But in reality, it was the Italian regime that used barbaric methods to enforce control. Graziani himself became known as the Butcher of Fezzan for his ruthlessness. In 1935, Mussolini launched a brutal invasion of Ethiopia too, aiming to expand Italy's colonial empire and boost national pride. The invasion, led by generals such as Pietro Badoglio and later Rodolfo Graziani, quickly turned into a campaign of terror. The Italian military didn't just fight the Ethiopian army, they targeted civilians in a deliberate effort to break the spirit of resistance. One of the most disturbing aspects of the campaign was the widespread use of chemical weapons. Italian planes dropped mustard gas on villages, crops, and water sources. This was not accidental. Italian commanders planned it. Thousands of civilians were exposed, suffering burns, lung damage, and slow, painful deaths. These attacks weren't limited to battlefields. Remote villages with no military presence were bombed simply to send a message. In addition to chemical warfare, Italian troops carried out mass executions of Ethiopian civilians. After any sign of resistance, entire communities were punished. Men were rounded up and shot without trial. The massacre at Debre Libanos in 1937 is one example where over 1,500 monks and pilgrims were killed in retaliation for an attempt on Graziani's life. Women suffered greatly under this campaign. Many were raped by Italian soldiers, sometimes in front of their families. Some of them were taken from villages and used as forced companions by Italian officers, a practice known as the Madamato system, where women were coerced into relationships with colonizers. Others were simply killed during the raids, their homes destroyed, and their children left orphaned. Italian propaganda described the invasion as a civilizing mission. But the reality on the ground was horrific. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and whole families wiped out. The goal wasn't just military victory, it was to completely subjugate the Ethiopian people through violence, terror, and humiliation. Even after Italy declared victory in 1936, the occupation continued with more repression and cruelty. Anyone suspected of resisting, even silently, could be jailed, tortured, and executed. Even in the face of Mussolini's brutal regime, many Italian women found the courage to fight back. These women became a key part of the anti-fascist resistance, especially during the later years of World War II. They were known as partigiane, female partisans who risked everything to oppose fascism and Nazi occupation. Most of these women were not trained soldiers. They were teachers, students, nurses, farmers, and mothers. But when Italy fell into chaos after 1943, many women chose to act. They couldn't stay silent as their towns were occupied, their families imprisoned, and their neighbors executed. So they joined the Italian resistance movement, a network of underground fighters battling against fascist and German forces. Their roles were crucial. Many women acted as couriers, secretly transporting messages, weapons, and medical supplies between partisan units. Others were saboteurs, helping to destroy rail lines, cut communication cables, and blow up bridges used by enemy forces. Some even took up arms and fought alongside male partisans in ambushes and skirmishes in the mountains and countryside. One famous figure was Irma Bandiera, a young woman who helped organize weapons delivered for the resistance in Bologna. After she was captured by fascist forces in 1944, She was tortured for days, but refused to reveal the names of her comrades. She was eventually executed, her body left in the street as a warning. Instead of intimidating people, her death inspired even more resistance. Captured female partisans were treated with particular cruelty. Fascists and Nazi troops often saw them as even more dangerous than male fighters because they were women stepping outside the roles society expected. Many were tortured in attempts to extract information. Some were raped before being killed. Others were sent to prisons or concentration camps, where survival was rare. Yet despite the risk, thousands of Italian women continued to resist. By the end of the war, it's estimated that over 35,000 women were actively involved in the resistance, and another 70,000 supported them in various ways. Their courage helped weaken fascist control, disrupt Nazi operations, and ultimately push Italy towards liberation. Their story is one of bravery, sacrifice, and silent defiance. These women didn't just resist a political system, they fought for freedom, for dignity, and for the future of their country, knowing they might never live to see it. When Mussolini's fascist regime finally collapsed in 1945, many hoped that justice would be served, but most of the crimes committed against women were quietly ignored. Now, the downfall of Mussolini didn't happen overnight. By early 1943, Italy was in crisis. The Axis powers were losing ground, and Italy had suffered a string of devastating military defeats in North Africa, the Balkans, and most notably, the Soviet Union, on the disastrous Eastern Front campaigns. The Italian economy was in ruins, food shortages were widespread, and bombing raids by the Allies were devastating cities and infrastructure. Civilian morale was collapsing, and many Italians had lost faith in Mussolini's leadership. In July 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, which dealt a critical blow to Mussolini's credibility. As Allied forces pushed forward, senior members of the Italian Fascist Grand Council, who had once been loyal to Mussolini, turned against him. On July 24-25, 1943, the council voted to strip him of power. The next day, King Victor Emmanuel III summoned Mussolini to his palace, dismissed him, and had him arrested by the Carabinieri. This marked the collapse of the original fascist regime. But Hitler was not willing to lose his southern ally so easily. In September 1943, German paratroopers carried out Operation Oak, a daring raid led by Otto Skorzeny to free Mussolini from his mountain prison at Gran Sasso. After his rescue, Mussolini was flown to northern Italy and installed as the head of the Italian Social Republic, a Nazi puppet state headquartered in Salo. The RSI was characterized by brutal repression, civil war, and widespread atrocities. Mussolini's power was now dependent entirely on Nazi Germany, and his government was isolated and unpopular. The fascist militia and German SS units carried out mass executions, deportations of Jews, and crackdowns on partisan resistance. But by early 1945, the German military was collapsing, and the partisan movement in Italy, composed of communists, liberals, monarchists, and others, was growing stronger. On April 25, 1945, as Allied and partisan forces advanced rapidly through northern Italy, Mussolini abandoned his base in Salo, disguised in a German uniform and traveling in a convoy of retreating German soldiers. He tried to escape to neutral Switzerland with his longtime mistress, Clara Petacci, and other loyal fascists. On April 27, 1945, the convoy was stopped near the village of Dongo on the western shore of Lake Como by Italian communist partisans. Mussolini was recognized and taken into custody. After a brief deliberation among the partisan leadership, the decision was made to execute him. On the morning of April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Petacci were taken to the village of Giulino di Mezzegra, where they were shot by a firing squad near a stone wall. Their bodies, along with several other fascist officials, were then transported to Piazzale Loreto in Milan, a place where 15 partisans had been publicly executed by fascists the year before. There, their corpses were hung upside down from a metal girder at a gas station for public display. Civilians jeered, threw stones, spat, and beat the bodies. A moment of brutal catharsis for a population that had suffered under years of dictatorship, war and repression. The new Italian Republic, formed in the aftermath of fascism, faced enormous pressure. The country was politically unstable, the economy was in ruins, and civil war tensions still lingered. To prevent further division, the government focused on reconciliation rather than punishment. This meant that many fascist officials, military officers, and collaborators who had abused women were never held accountable. In fact, some former fascists were even allowed to return to public life. Trials for war crimes were rare and often limited in scope. Italian courts and officials didn't investigate the sexual violence, the torture, or forced confinement that thousands of women had endured. The crimes that had taken place in concentration camps, occupied territories, and prisons were left out of history books and public discussion. The Allied powers, particularly the British and Americans, also played a role in the silence. Their top priority was stopping the spread of communism in post-war Europe. Italy, seen as a strategic ally in the new Cold War, was given support and encouragement to stabilize quickly. That meant avoiding deep investigations into past crimes that could further destabilize the country or embarrass powerful figures. As a result, many victims were left without justice or recognition. Survivors of rape, forced labor, or internment were expected to stay quiet. Some were even shamed by their communities for what they had gone through. Talking about these experiences was taboo, and there were few support systems for those who had suffered. It wasn't just a political silence, it became a cultural one. The role of women in the resistance was celebrated, but the violence they endured during the fascist years was largely erased from public memory. For decades, historians, politicians, and media barely mentioned the crimes committed by Mussolini's regime against women. Only in recent years, thanks to feminist researchers, survivors' testimonies, and newly uncovered documents, have these stories begun to surface. Slowly, Italy has started to confront this dark chapter of its past. But for many victims and their families, this recognition came too late.